The accusation is that Al Jazeera English did not do enough to support them. They were operating illegally in Cairo without a license, in a bureau that was not licensed, and with using correspondents who did not have permits to be working in Egypt, and that all of that put these people at risk. How do you answer that?
My answer is simple. Safety underpins what we do. The duty of care and the provision of care to our staff in Egypt and right across the world is in a way the precursor to actually the editorial output and news gathering that we do on a daily or minutely basis. That's fundamental to understand, and I can talk more about that provision of safety. But also, you mentioned that we're operating illegally in Egypt. That simply isn't the case. Al Jazeera English is fully licensed, was fully licensed to operate as a channel and to news gather and to do its job in Egypt. There's been a lot of discussion about accreditation. Were our guys accredited? Some of our guys were accredited. We had applied for accreditation for our teams on the ground, as indeed many other journalists working for many other organisations applied for accreditation, and at that time, it was not forthcoming. But accreditation is not, or not having accreditation, is not illegal.
We have seen, some emails have been told about others in which these security concerns were raised repeatedly with headquarters in Doha. Mohamed Fahmy, for instance, very soon after he took on the job of bureau chief, sends an email saying, "I'm concerned about our legal status here. I'd like to try to do something about it." And he's basically told, stick to editorial. Management will deal with this. There is this broadly based perception that they were not being protected by headquarters.
Mohamed and the team raised their own safety and their situation in Egypt many times over. That's part of the normal dialogue about safety. Right. And let's be clear, that should be entirely separate to editorial. The natural instinct of a journalist is to want to get out and do the story, but the safety provision, we had a head of high-risk deployment who briefs the leadership team, myself included, every day. That sits separate to the editorial, and rightfully so we can make the right decisions about safety.
Speaking of editorial then, I want to just again to reiterate that we understand what a critical time this was. Mubashir Misr had been shut down. That obviously limited the news gathering abilities in Egypt at the time. One of the allegations that we have heard, or the complaints that we have heard, is that because of that, Al Jazeera English packages started appearing on Mubashir Misr broadcasts that were now coming out of Doha, and which at that point was an illegal entity, a banned entity, and that put your people in even further danger.
At Al Jazeera Network, all the video that's shot across the different channels is available to all the different channels. That video is utilised by Al Jazeera Arabic, and their video we utilise. Each channel has its own demographic, its own different audience. So we're a global channel broadcasting to people right across the globe. Our agenda is therefore de facto different to the agenda of Al Jazeera Arabic, to the agenda of Al Jazeera Mubashir, to the agenda of Al Jazeera Balkans and Al Jazeera America. At no point were Al Jazeera English packages in full aired on Al Jazeera Mubashir Misr, because they are in Arabic and they're aiming at a different demographic.
Well, Mohamed Fahmy has provided us with, or his family has provided us with emails that show, in fact, in two specific occasions, that's exactly what happened. We have heard from other people that this was not an unusual event.
But I think we need to be clear that as it were, the sharing of video, which is then dealt with by each individual channel for its own editorial.
No, these were edited packages.
I'd have to see the package to answer that really in detail.
But that would be against policy, would it?
It would be very unusual, I'd put it that way, because you wouldn't take an entire package from one of the other network channels and simply copy-paste it onto your own channel.
Well, you translate it, but then you would...
Yeah, you reversion. You reversion the video, you reversion a package, and it will go out in a different channel. That's normal practice. But that's different to saying I'll take something that's gone onto a different channel and copy and paste it out, if you see what I mean.
Well, that's what the allegation is, and the point that they make is that at a time when Mubashir Misr was illegal in Egypt, by doing that, you were putting the people who had made those packages, your English employees, in grave danger.
But I think the important thing to stress here is that Al Jazeera Mubashir Misr, Al Jazeera Arabic, Al Jazeera English, Al Jazeera Balkans, they are all separate channels within a much wider network. And each one of those channels is obviously reaching out to its own demographic, its own audience. So there may be a sharing of content across the network, and that's absolutely right, but that doesn't mean that therefore there is a direct copy-paste from one channel to the other. Each channel has its own editorial board, and as a result of reaching out to its own demographic, make its own editorial decisions about the content that goes out.
Do you agree that if that had happened, that at a time when Mubashir Misr was seen as an illegal broadcaster in Egypt, that would have potentially had a detrimental effect on the Al Jazeera English employees who were trying to work?
Yeah, again, I think the important thing to recognize is a separation because of the different legal entities between Mubashir Misr and Al Jazeera English. And that in the context at the time of the legal status of Mubashir Misr, then that needed to be taken into account, and was certainly taken into account when we were looking at the safety of our guys in Egypt.
What efforts did the network make to make that difference clear to Egyptian authorities? The fact that these were two separate entities with their own editorial policies, etc.
First of all, I think it's crystal clear to the Egyptian authorities, the separation in terms of the legal entities and in terms of the difference between Mubashir Misr, for one simple reason, that it's broadcasting from Egypt. So it was based in Egypt, and the other network channels that are based elsewhere and broadcasting across the globe for Al Jazeera English, and therefore including into Egypt. So there was a clear understanding with the authorities of the separation. But the other thing, if you widen it out from the authorities and look at the people in Egypt who are looking at the different content that's coming in from the different Al Jazeera channels, it's crystal clear to see that Al Jazeera English, in English as a global broadcaster, is a different editorial entity to the other network channels.
Did you have a permit to broadcast from the Marriott?
Yes, we moved to the Marriott for one simple reason, that the Al Jazeera office, which was us, AJE, and Al Jazeera Arabic, was raided and shut down. Al Jazeera Mubashir Misr was in a separate location entirely to our offices in Cairo. So we were not operating under the radar. It was fully public knowledge that we were in the Marriott, and we were doing so. We were broadcasting. There was nothing hidden. We were there to be. And if I can be really clear, there was no decision to operate without accreditation. We continued to ask for accreditation, and we did indeed have accreditation for some of the members of our team. So there was no decision taken, and we were fully licensed to operate. That's the fact.
As we now know, and I believe as you now know, there were interrogations done with the three journalists, and in particular there was an interrogation done with Bahar, in which he says some things that I think, coming from a journalist about his employer, would be damning. And I'm assuming you're familiar with the details of Bahar's interrogation. Is he right? Was he getting direction to manipulate coverage? Was he being asked to make it more pro-Muslim Brotherhood?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The integrity of our output, the integrity of our journalism underpins what we do in every corner of the world and in Egypt. And when you get a story as complicated as, in a way, politically diverse or divided as this, that integrity is a journalistic challenge to make sure that the standards of journalism that we've upheld since our very first day and continue to do so continue every second of every day on our output. The one thing I'd like to add on, though, I think Bahar was probably under great pressure. I don't believe there was a lawyer absent when those questions were asked.
There was a lawyer present, and we spoke with the lawyer who was present, and he said that there was no coercion, there was no inducement, that Bahar, to his view, was speaking what he believed to be the truth?
When I look at some of the comments that were made, I genuinely am concerned that Bahar, a guy with great integrity and a great journalist, felt under pressure. And look, the reality from AJE's perspective is that integrity is fundamentally important to our output. We have put every bit of our output, every package we've done, online for everyone to see. And that ultimately is the answer for me. The integrity of the output, the fact that, of course, we weren't steering in one direction or another direction. That's not what we do. We are journalists with great integrity. That's the foundation of Al Jazeera English, and that is clear to see on our output. That's the final, sort of arbitrary in a way, is watch the content for yourself, and you will see that integrity.
Partway through the trial, Al Jazeera launches a civil lawsuit, $150 million civil lawsuit against the state of Egypt for damages done related to the closures of its bureaus, etc., etc. At a time when you have 3 journalists fighting for their freedom in an Egyptian court, that cannot have been helpful, can it? To be seen as antagonizing the Egyptians at that point.
I think it's really important that every avenue was explored in order to keep pressure. There were separate legal, you're talking about separate legal challenges, as it were.
Yeah.
And again, the important one for Peter, Mohamed and Bahar was the 13 hearings that led up to these outrageous sentences.
Sure.
The pressure that was brought to bear from lots of different avenues, from the political pressure, from people, governments, corporations and peoples around the world standing up and saying enough is enough. This is simply not right what you're doing in Egypt, and you've got to free these guys.
So it was a tactic at that point to bring additional pressure on Egypt. That's why you launched the lawsuit.
Look, I think the answer to it is every avenue needed to be explored in order to maintain pressure on the authorities in Egypt. But I come back to the point, the most important focus of the attention is the legal case that went on through the many hearings that led to the ultimate outcome.
Do you take any responsibility? Obviously you didn't put them in jail, but did your actions or lack of action in any way contribute to the possibility or the likelihood that they were going to be arrested?
Look, I think the very simple answer to that question, and it's a very fair question, and yes, we have been through every step of what led to these outrageous sentences. And we've asked ourselves the question time and time and time again, is there something we could or should have done differently? And look, the reality is, when those sentences were passed on that day, and that outrageous conclusion to months, 13 hearings, where there was no evidence, zero evidence, not a shred of evidence, where the process was fundamentally flawed, and yet it led to that outcome. And I think one has to ask a different question in a way about who is responsible for that outcome.
Will you be paying for Mohamed Fahmy's lawyer?
We were supporting the families in everything they're doing.
But that doesn't answer the question. Will you be paying for his lawyer?
We have paid for the lawyers, or we've engaged a lawyer to represent the 3 in court, who has got a very solid team working on the case as we speak. And Mohamed has decided that he would like to have his own lawyer. Now, obviously, we're supporting Mohamed and his family throughout, and we will continue to do so.